Picture this. You're holding what appears to be an ordinary piece of paper money in your hand. But behind that simple note lies a promise, a guarantee that somewhere in a vault, there's real wealth backing it up. Gold, silver, something tangible that gives your money actual value. Now imagine waking up one morning to discover that the entire mountain of precious metal supposedly protecting your currency has simply vanished into thin air. Not stolen by foreign armies, not lost in some natural disaster, just gone as if it never existed at all. This isn't some hypothetical nightmare. This is exactly what happened to one of the most powerful empires in human history. And the shockwaves from that disappearance are still shaking the global financial system today. In 1914, as Europe marched toward the most devastating war the world had ever seen, the Russian Empire was sitting pretty. Tsar Nicholas II controlled not just the largest landmass on Earth, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, but also one of the most impressive treasure hoards in human history. Over 1,200 metric tons of pure gold sat locked away in imperial vaults. To put that in perspective, Russia held more gold than Germany, Britain, and the United States combined. More bullion than most nations could dream of accumulating in a century. This wasn't just wealth for the sake of showing off. This gold was the backbone of Russia's entire monetary system. Every ruble in circulation was backed by real metal. Every government bond, every international trade deal, every promise the empire made to its people and its creditors rested on that glittering foundation. The world trusted Russian currency precisely because everyone knew there was genuine treasure behind it. When you held a Russian ruble, you weren't just holding a piece of paper, you were holding a claim on actual gold. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. Because within just 3 years, that massive hoard would be scattered to the winds. Billions of dollars worth of precious metal by today's standards would disappear in ways that still baffle historians. Some of it melted down and sold to fund revolution. Some of it shipped across borders in unmarked trains. Some of it allegedly dumped into frozen lakes to keep it from enemy hands. And some of it simply vanished without a trace, as if the earth had swallowed it whole. The mystery isn't just about missing gold, it's about how quickly and completely the financial foundation of an entire civilization can be destroyed. Because when Russia's gold disappeared, so did everything that gold represented. Trust, stability, the promise that money means something real. And in its place came chaos, hyperinflation, and a collapse so complete that it took decades to rebuild even a shadow of what had been lost. Most people think the Russian Revolution was about politics and ideology. Workers versus aristocrats, communists versus capitalists, the people rising up against their oppressors. All of that is true. But underneath those dramatic headlines was a more fundamental story. A story about money, power, and what happens when the anchor holding an entire economic system in place suddenly snaps. The trouble began almost immediately when the Great War erupted in 1914. Russia, like every other major power, had to transform its entire economy overnight. Peaceful industries were converted to weapons production. Millions of men were pulled from farms and factories to march toward German machine guns. Railways that once carried grain and goods were redirected to move troops and ammunition. And all of this cost money on a scale no empire had ever faced before. Within months, Russia was burning through its gold reserves at a terrifying pace. Military spending didn't just increase, it tripled within 2 years. Artillery shells, rifles, uniforms, medical supplies, food for armies, fuel for vehicles. Everything had to be purchased, often from foreign suppliers who demanded payment in hard currency. Not promises, not promissory notes, but actual gold or its equivalent. The Russian government found itself caught in an impossible bind. Keep fighting the war and watch the gold reserves drain away. Stop fighting and face defeat, revolution, and the collapse of the empire anyway. They chose to keep fighting, but they also made a fatal decision that would haunt the empire's final years. They began printing rubles far beyond what their shrinking gold reserves could support. At first, nobody seemed to notice. There was so much chaos, so much focus on the war effort, that the gradual debasement of the currency flew under the radar. But inflation has a way of making itself known. Bread that once cost a few kopecks suddenly required handfuls of rubles. Workers found their wages buying less and less each month. Peasants in the countryside began refusing to sell their crops for increasingly worthless paper money. By 1916, the signs were everywhere. Strikes in the cities, food shortages even in the capital. Soldiers at the front going without proper equipment because the government could no longer afford to purchase what they needed. The gold that had once made Russia's promises credible was flowing out of the country faster than water through a broken dam. And then came 1917, the year everything fell apart. The February Revolution toppled the Tsar. The October Revolution brought the Bolsheviks to power. Civil war erupted across the empire. And in the midst of all this chaos, trainloads of gold began moving across the vast Russian landscape, heading toward destinations that remain mysterious to this day. What happened next reads like something out of a spy thriller, except the stakes were real and the consequences would reshape the entire world. Picture freight trains rumbling through the frozen wilderness of Siberia, their cargo cars packed with wooden crates containing more wealth than most people could imagine. Each crate held gold bars, coins, and bullion that represented the financial lifeblood of a dying empire. But these weren't ordinary shipments moving along predictable routes with reliable destinations. These were desperate attempts to save what remained of Russia's treasure from the chaos consuming the country. And many of those trains would never reach their intended destinations. The provisional government that replaced the Tsar faced an impossible situation. Keep the gold in the capital and risk having it seized by revolutionary forces. Move it west and risk having it captured by German armies advancing toward Petrograd. The only option that seemed safe was to send it east, deep into the Siberian interior where it might survive whatever political storms were coming. But here's the problem with that plan. The deeper into Siberia those gold shipments went, the further they traveled from any real oversight or control. The soldiers guarding those trains were thousands of miles from their commanders. The railway workers moving the cargo had families to feed and their own survival to worry about. And the local officials supposed to receive and secure the gold were watching their entire world collapse around them. I see. It didn't take long for people to start asking uncomfortable questions. If a train carrying gold disappeared into a snowstorm, who would ever know? If a few crates went missing during a routine transfer, who was keeping track? If corrupt officials decided to help themselves to a small portion of the treasure, who was going to stop them? The answer, as it turned out, was nobody. Because by late 1917, there was no functioning government left with the authority or ability to monitor what was happening to Russia's gold reserves. The Bolsheviks controlled some cities, the White Armies controlled others, and vast stretches of the empire were essentially lawless. In that kind of environment, gold shipments became targets for everyone from organized criminals to desperate military units, to foreign agents looking to profit from Russia's misery. Admiral Kolchak, the leader of the anti-Bolshevik forces in Siberia, managed to get his hands on what may have been the largest single concentration of Russian gold outside of Moscow. Intelligence reports from the time suggest 100 metric tons of bull he controlled over Fivian in the city of Kazan. That's enough gold to fund entire armies, buy weapons from abroad, or establish a completely new currency if necessary. But Kolchak's story illustrates perfectly how quickly vast wealth can evaporate during times of crisis. As his forces retreated before advancing Bolshevik armies, that massive horde began to scatter. Some of it was used to purchase weapons and supplies. Some was allegedly shipped to Japan in exchange for military aid. Some simply disappeared as corrupt officers and officials helped themselves to what they could carry. When the Bolsheviks finally captured Kolchak in 1920 and executed him as a counter-revolutionary, they expected to recover hundreds of tons of gold. Instead, they found empty warehouses and contradictory records that made it impossible to determine where the treasure had gone. Entire trainloads of bullion had vanished as completely as if they had been dropped into a black hole. Meanwhile, foreign powers were playing their own games with Russian gold. Britain, France, Japan, and the United States all had troops on Russian soil during the Civil War, officially to support anti-Bolshevik forces, but in reality, to protect their own interests. And those interests included recovering gold that Russia owed them for wartime loans and equipment purchases. The mystery of Russia's missing gold isn't just a century-old puzzle about vanished treasure. It's a warning about what happens when the foundations of financial trust crumble. Today, as governments print trillions and central banks manipulate currencies, remember that even the world's largest gold reserves can disappear overnight. The lesson is brutal but necessary. Real wealth isn't paper promises or digital numbers. It's what survives when everything else collapses. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with terrifying precision.